The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Estou passando nesse podcast para dividir uma informação que fez toda a diferença na minha vida. Quer fazer pós-graduação, mas tá impossível correr de um lugar para o outro?
Pois é, ainda mais com o trânsito.
Então você precisa conhecer a educação à distância do Senac. Sabia que é nota máxima no MEC? E tem diversos cursos de pós-graduação para te levar ainda mais longe. 100% online, sem necessidade de TCC e com acesso direto a todos os professores.
Ah, saber isso fez diferença sim.
Inscreva-se já na pós-graduação EAD. Quer saber? Senac EAD.
Okay, so just edit me out here. I'm just like, but seriously, no, continue here and cut.
No mai haere mai piki mai kaki mai. This is Toby Manhire over opposite me. You can't see him, but I can. It's Ben Thomas, and to his right and my left, Annabelle Mather. I'm painting a picture here. Across the other corner of the studio is Samuel.
Kia ora.
How is everybody today?
Pai ana, e ora ana.
Feeling the heat.
It's been a gorgeous
Well,
Auckland
you look
summer.
hot
There's
in that yellow t-shirt.
It's the dying days of summer, and it's the heat from the Wellington, from the great briefing paper fire of Wellington 2023.
Oh, you can see why he is in such hot demand as a pundit, can't you?
You can, yeah.
Just that. See how the magic happens there. He didn't have that written down. He just conjured it out of thin air.
I left my piece of paper in the car, so.
On the agenda today, the great policy fire that Ben just made mention of, and the work of New Zealand's Marie Kondo Prime Minister, what it all means for the Greens, National's attempts to grab back some momentum, and a new poll. What do we call this? The reprioritisation is, I think, the official term. So there's a broad lexicon. There's the bonfire, which, of course, evokes 15th century Florence and Tom Wolfe and Wall Street. There's the cull, which brings to mind foot and mouth ridden livestock. There's the purge, which obviously has notes of Joseph Stalin. What do you like, Annabelle?
I like Te Ahi Komo, which means the volcanic fire.
Powerful. Might hear that for
Feels
Tranche.
like a vibe.
Tranche 3, Mr. Hipkins. Ben.
I got the bread and butter kitchen cabinet fire, the scorched earth policy. The Greens can use that if they want.
Right. The scorched policy earth.
The onward Chris Hipkins smolder.
Nice.
Burn baby burn fiscal inferno.
Oh my God, I love that.
Policies like Hipkins from the Hut because they're getting blazed. Oh, wait. Oh, definitely from the Hut because the PM just smoked the Greens.
So good.
How long have we got? I got a few more.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up now, actually. It's a lot of stuff has been axed or deferred, i.e. kicked past the next term, may or may not happen, or shrunk rapidly. I've got a list of my own here. If you already know all the things, then you can skip forward by 30 seconds or 3 minutes or however long it's going to take me to quickly list them. In the first round of the purge, we had the media merger, biofuel mandates, hate speech legislation, unemployment insurance, and then on Monday this week, we had the cash for clunkers policy, the upgrade scheme, which was the sort of headline policy in the release of the emissions reduction plan, 6 months ago or so, sometime last year, as was the social car leasing scheme, also gone. Also gone, or at least deferred, are the alcohol advertising reforms, although Chloe Swarbrick has a members bill which she'll try and reignite and get some support for. Container refund scheme, gone. Contractor employment status reforms, gone. Voting age stuff, mostly gone. Local government stuff might reply. The speed limit restriction program has been refocused to the 1% of most dangerous roads. Public transport initiatives shrunk, and light rail has been slowed down, which is a relief because it was hurtling so fast. That project, we all had speed wobbles, didn't we?
Marketing vibes,
After 5.5 years of business cases and PowerPoint presentations, the government thought it was time to just slow down and catch our breath.
Can we all just have a cup of tea? Yeah. So
what did they do? They did a sod turning. I think at the beginning of the year
they
to
did
show
a kind of terrain exploration. They plunged a pole into the ground.
They plunged a pole into the ground.
I don't think they'd got so far.
And now everyone needs a rest. Everyone just needs
We're just going to stage this out. Rome wasn't built in a day. Overall, it's this kind of ever-decreasing circles of government policy, of the work program, both parties in a battle to be littler than the other. I've got a theory about all this, which I'd like to try out on you. Have you noticed that a number of politicians seem to have been hit by lightning before?
What is that about?
So we've had Maureen Pugh has been hit by lightning several hundred times. Aisha Varel said last week, I think, on the Tiles podcast, that she'd been struck by lightning.
So was she hit by lightning, or was she in a plane that was struck by lightning?
I can't tell you that. But I do know that the advice when you're in an environment where lightning might be around is to make yourself as small as possible. And so I think that what I'm thinking is the New Zealand's parliament has become so focused on being tiny to avoid being hit by lightning that has filtered through to the politics, policy, the work program.
Chris Hipkins probably saw a reference to conductors on the light rail proposal and was like, get it out of here.
Joe Meyer, did you see Joe Moyer's column this week? Quite a good one, in which she came out of that Monday post-cabinet press conference in which the latest tranche of axed policies was announced, and she's asking questions in the press conference trying to find out what Chris Hipkins was actually standing for rather than standing against. And in her column, she referred to Bill English's answer in an election debate in 2017 when asked what he would march in the streets for, and he said, I would march in the streets to govern New Zealand. And Chris Hipkins indicated that what he was all about was, a range of things over the next 3 years in government. It is this sort of sense, Joe described it as, cynical politics at its most depressing or something like that. And there is something a bit depressing if that everything is totally about being re-elected. If that's, politics being the art of winning.
Daniel McLaughlin had a great line many years ago where he said that the sort of scales fell from his eyes one day when he realised that the main thing that, the opposition leader opposed about the government was its policy of having a different prime minister. And and you can see this clearly. Now, there are ways to be sort of less cynical about it. You could say Hipkins has realised that whatever changes the government wants to get through, anything that they put through during this election year is very much at risk if they lose the election. National's policy platform has long been to, get rid of Jacinda Ardern's policies.
Yes.
And so this is just Labour matching that. So from that point of view, winning is the first and necessary step to doing any of the kind of positive things that you want to do. And you see a bit of that in the sense that Hipkins hasn't killed a lot of these policies. Some of them he's merely deferred. And even some of the things that he's killed, you could sort of say, well, maybe they'll be back in a different form.
Maybe.
But yeah, what we are seeing right now is this really interesting agglomeration where both of the major parties are relatively weak in electoral terms, sort of in the early mid-30s. But the combined suite of policies that they represent is supported by about 70% of the population. and it's almost like an internal leadership tussle to see who gets to be the Prime Minister presiding over those policies.
And, I mean, arguably this is the nature of MMP politics, I guess, Annabelle, these two radically centrist parties, going for that medium voter, going for the middle bit, and then the more the sort of stronger policy platforms will come from their putative coalition partners, because we know very clearly that we have a kind of, in a way, a prototypical MMP election where we're looking at, we'll come to that a bit later about how the Māori Party might fit in.
I'm not sure if the Greens will be feeling that way this week after everything that got chucked in the kitchen cabinet fire. I mean, I agree with Joe. I can, and I think many will, that, it does look cynical, but equally, I think Luxon is trying to shed the skin of Ardern's government that on one hand was thought of as overly ambitious and equally thought of as not being able to achieve anything or get the basics right to deliver. And so I don't think he has much choice. I think it's quite a pragmatic move to get rid of some of these policies. And I think, most of them aren't ones that were going to, if you'll excuse the pun, set the world on fire. But, Chloe Swarbrick, for example, with the alcohol advertising one, you have to wonder why he got rid of that one. It's...
Well, it's all about distractions. I think when you said Luxon before, you meant Hipkins, but it's an easy mistake to make lately, I suppose.
And so with the alcohol bill, where does that hit the road? Probably with, with sports organisations who would be talking about how they needed, time to transition to new sponsorship arrangements, things like that, who would be asking for government money, and those are the sorts of fights that Hipkins doesn't want to get involved in.
That's the bandwidth shorthand, isn't it? So we're sort of, whenever the question is, well, hang on a minute, this isn't really about saving money, is it? This isn't about tightening belts to deal with the cost of living crisis. And then it's also about bandwidth, which means it's a distraction. It could create us some problems along the way. We don't want to get stuck on that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. And so, if Hipkins does stand for anything this early on in his sort of leadership, it's, as Luke Malpass and stuff said yesterday, it's about making concrete improvements to people's standard of living. Now, fortuitously, that also coincides with the same kinds of policies that you would need to bribe members of the electorate in an election year, which is to say, all of the major moves by Labour under Hipkins have been about cash transfers. So yesterday there was the announcement that less than 1 year after taking the Welfare Expert Advisory Group's recommendation to index benefits to the rate of wage increases rather than inflation, they're swapping that back around because inflation is higher this year.
For 1 year.
Yeah. And superannuation, never any change with that, but they're just going to...
They're going to give it to...
He's going to top up the old guys, top up the old people, including the 30,000 who are all earning over 100 grand, even outside their superannuation this year, because, and the other thing is, the minimum wage increases, whereas National, which we'll talk about later, have come in with, their early childhood subsidies. And so what it's looking like is a kind of game of Tetris, where both of the major parties are just trying to most optimally fill, that block right up to the 50.1th percentile with voting groups that they can sort of carve off with cash subsidies. So it's almost like a math problem for the two major parties right now.
Annabelle's right, though, when you look at the list, particularly the second one, and you had to colour code them in terms of which was the party that either proposed them or was championing them, and a lot of that colour would be green, right? And then you add to that the extension of the cut in fuel tax. You add the biofuel thing from the first round. It's a pretty bitter pill for the Greens to swallow. Co-leaders were called in for their first meeting with Hipkins, I think, on the morning of the announcement, and pretty well just informed. And, they were dazzled by his affable boy from the hut and seemingly didn't kick up too much of a fuss. There's been some suggestion that actually this kind of plays quite well for the Greens. And there's some truth in that, isn't there, Annabelle? And that there is some truth that the Greens have got plenty to shout about now. They can say, and they have been, look, if you want us to have influence, if you want us to make a difference, you need to vote us in bigger numbers and get us around the cabinet table. At the moment, their votes are immaterial to a one-party majority government that has a cooperation agreement, which is nice, quite short, but very general vibesy rather than anything concrete that you'd see in a confidence and supply agreement, let alone a full-blown coalition deal.
When we destroy your agenda, you will be the first to know. We are picking the phone straight up.
There is,
it's very manner-enhancing.
So the argument goes, and there's something in this, and I would argue, but only something really, but there is something in it that the political MMP chess would be Labour is going to manoeuvre towards that median voter and nibble away votes from the National Party. Meanwhile, the Greens, we're going to leave you territory to nibble into our vote. The overall block, because that's how MMP works, grows. Anything wrong with that?
No, but with what's happened over the last couple of days, on one hand, it is a good thing for the Greens. Like, it gives them something to rail against. It separates them away from the government in election year, which is always a problem with minor parties. And I kind of feel for the Greens because they've been in that predicament that so many minor parties get into, which is you get offered the opportunity to be in government like the Māori Party were when you're not really needed in government, like supermajority kind of thing. And so do you hold out and, fire missiles from the cross-party benches, or, are you better to work within the government and try and get some gains for your party? I think, there's arguments to be made for both sides of that. I think the problem that the Green Party had is that, unlike the Māori Party, who I think had only been in Parliament for a term when they became part of government, is that they had been in Parliament so long that and it was their first opportunity to become not a part of government, but to have that kind of arrangement, they kind of didn't have any choice really but to get into it. I feel like Labour hasn't been a very good partner to them. But, I guess the bump that we've seen in the latest lot of polls, just goes to show that people do still care about the environment and climate change, is here. It's not some idea that, people haven't got their heads around yet. So I do think that there's going to be more space for the Greens out further on the left, especially as we see National and Labour crunching towards the middle. So, while a couple of weeks ago it looked like all doom and gloom for the Greens, I actually think that they're probably in not too bad a position going into election year.
Certainly the Curia poll for the Taxpayers Union last week, which put the Greens on 5.7%, reputable poll, if that had been reflected in the Kantar poll for One News this week, then I think the conversation about the Greens would be taking a slightly different hue. They got 11% in that poll. But still, Ben, the idea that the Greens are kind of complicit in a masquerade to create this kind of, manoeuvring seems to me at least quite partly fanciful, because the Greens are not one sort of autonomous unit. There are a bunch of different views. There are a lot of very cross people in that Green caucus. Many don't agree with James Shaw's kind of patient insistence that it's better to be inside the tent than outside the tent. Many would really quite like to be outside the tent and, mounting concerted pissing attacks on the tent. With more than 6 months to go towards an election, it seems to me that the idea that this is just going to play out nicely and they will adopt their own territory and so on is probably a bit optimistic from their point of view.
The Greens tend to do well when they are supporting Labour rather than when they're attacking Labour. It's just one of those strange contradictions. When the Greens go hard and call Labour climate sellouts and things like that, it doesn't tend to improve their voting. And that might be a function of the kinds of people who vote Green as opposed to the kinds of people who are Green activists and Green members, which is much more suburban, it's much more high income, it's much more middle-aged.
Do you think that's because during those times Labour was in opposition?
No, it seems to be pretty consistent throughout. They're obviously their vote tends to improve when Labour are weak as well, but their vote doesn't seem to improve by them attacking.
I guess the terrain has changed a bit insofar as the Labour Party, for all that Chris Hipkins says he agrees with climate change being the nuclear-free moment of the generation, has the actions of recent days suggest otherwise.
Yeah. Oh, look, yeah, clearly that's been signalled. On the other hand, there is something to the argument that the schemes that have been scrapped were very expensive for not a great return. Minuscule reductions in emissions compared to
as far as the emissions budget is concerned, it could be much more efficiently spent. And I guess we need to sort of wait and see what that amounts to, whether it comes in the budget proper or not.
Yeah, but things like, electric cars are something that the Green voters love, right? But the actual emissions reductions compared to things like industrial processes, on an individual level are much lower and the costs are much higher. Hipkins says that the clean car discounts are sort of doing their job right now. That's probably helped by the cost of second-hand cars. My old clunker, which I was hoping the government might bail out to the tune of $500 million or something if there's a global financial crisis, which I'm probably going to have to try and get another couple of 100,000 Ks out of, because, man, second-hand cars are really expensive.
What are you going to go for in the end? Are you going to get a plug-in hybrid?
I think one of the 3 catastrophic issues with my car resolved itself, so I'm going to try and run it into the ground further.
Was that when you removed sort of 300 food wrappers from
that was when the window went up again. It hadn't gone up. It had been stuck for about a week, and I was like, What was your solution to that?
That's
How did you?
Eventually, it just worked.
It opened.
Yeah, eventually it just worked.
That's all true. But then when you look at things like the alcohol reforms being dumped, Chloe Swarbrick told me that was a slap in the face to all the people who have been working on it, around the country over a year and a half, and review after review had recommended it. Eugenie Sage, who's leaving Parliament this year, I thought was one of the most kind of forceful and compelling. She was just really aghast with the container refund scheme, right?
Which is something she was working on as Environment Minister.
Felt like a footnote in the announcement, but she was just, to paraphrase, what the actual fuck? All that she sort of put it in. All these officials have been working on it. There have been a lot of energy in it. Within Parliament, within the I think MB that were doing the work, and she's clearly just staring at this, going, what does this have to do with cost of living belt tightening? What does it have to do with bandwidth? The idea that those officials are suddenly going to shift across to cost of living payments doesn't really wash, and.
Well, the thing too
it
is
seems
like,
weird.
Yeah, it's like they wouldn't have had trouble passing it. So what's the problem?
The issue for all of these things is that the Greens are living in the same way that climate deniers are living in an old world that no longer exists. The Greens are living in an old world that no longer exists, one where policy is based on your values and evidence and you know, your priorities in government, what you think will help. That's gone. That's been gone since Labour pulled up level with National and got a sniff of winning the election. Yeah. That is over now. What we have now is overnight polls, focus groups, and media headlines. And that is how policy is going to be decided between now and October. And anybody who has, you know, the Greens obviously will never sort of, you know, have never and will never register that. And it's, you know, it's hardly an ideal sort of way to create policy. But while the polls are tight, that's what's happening now.
Is that a good argument?
Bro, that you nailed it.
Is that a good argument also for a 4-year term? Maybe we can talk about that another time. But there is a sense in which if it's we're all just actually it's fully election in year 3 every time, then it does, you know, you add a little bit of a pandemic or a financial crisis into the mix.
I don't think it is, you know, but this isn't typical even of election years, right? What it's typical of is, you know, Hipkins has come in, he's been Prime Minister for 7 weeks. He wants to be Prime Minister for more than 10 months. He wants to have at least 3 years. And he doesn't have to go back on his word. He doesn't have to backtrack on anything. New Prime Minister, new reality. We've entered the multiverse, right? Anything can happen. You know, we're now in an alternate reality where Jacinda Ardern's policies have all just sort of slipped into the void, and it's a new day. So I don't know that this is typical of 3-year terms. You know, there is always obviously electioneering during election years. That's just normal. But I think right now it's almost unprecedentedly unanchored, you know, in recent history.
Em busca de novo hit para animar seu dia? Então clique no banner e ouça a playlist com as melhores músicas. Um oferecimento Nova Fiat Titano. A nova picape da Fiat faz bonito nos terrenos mais desafiadores. Performance com motor turbo diesel 4x4 e câmera 360 graus off-road, que ajudam você a ultrapassar qualquer obstáculo. Sem falar que ela tem a maior caçamba da categoria. Tá esperando o que para conhecer? Nova Fiat Titano. Chegou a sua vez de fazer história. Paz no Trânsito começa por você.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
Let's go back to Sunday before last. Christopher Luxon in Parnell stood before the Party Faithful for a speech that had been delayed once and maybe twice, his State of the Nation address in election year. And the challenge was to kind of grab back the initiative. The policy announcement, we hadn't had many policy announcements. Remember the Three Waters thing had sort of come out almost kind of awkwardly the weekend before at the Blue Greens conference, and then the whole Rob Campbell saga set off. I think we talked about that a little bit. It just happened when we were in the last podcast. But Christopher Luxon's policy announcement was a childcare rebate. If you close your eyes, it could have easily been a Labour policy announcement. It wasn't that different in some characteristics to the policy announced at the Labour Party conference in November. And then the other side of the coin, the how do you pay for it? Because, of course, one of the first questions that levelled it with any policy is that going to be inflationary? Was a little bit of what most people regarded as a pretty clever ploy, which is we're going to pay for it by killing all the consultants by targeting consultants and in the public sector and public sector contractors. Ben, what did you make of all that? Was the momentum grabbed back? Were the policies sound? And tell us a little bit, as someone who's spent many of your happiest days in Wellington, whether or not there is that flab in the consultant contractor layer to find, what did they say, 400 million, I think?
400 million. Yeah. It's on the policy itself. I don't have young kids. I've never paid for ECE. But it is essentially in that universe of simply a cash transfer, which is what I think we will increasingly see as the basis for policies heading towards the election. Basically just a count up of how much any individual voting group will get from each of the major parties. Now, to that end, it seemed pretty successful. People with families seem to think that's pretty helpful. There's questions about whether the sector will absorb a subsidy in the same way that there is with any kind of subsidy, increasing accommodation allowances, increasing student allowances. And I'm sure there will be some of that, but, overall, it's cash in the hand for young parents. And that's something that has been successful for Labour, in its time in government. Like you said, very clear raid on Labour territory, sort of humanises Luxon, small kids. Basically it's just that exercise of just really narrowing the window, of any daylight between the government and the opposition, which was started by Labour, but, National sort of raiding into that territory as well, and eventually they're going to meet in the middle, and there will be one set of policies that has wide support, and you just have to choose which leader you want for it, right? Yeah. And in terms of and very clever tying it into the consultancy costs. One, because the big challenge that the opposition has in an election year is playing by the government's rules. The government, by dint of being in the government, everything currently is affordable that's on the table. And the challenge for the opposition is, how are you going to pay for whatever you want to bring in? Because both parties are sort of committed to keeping debt as low as possible, no more inflationary borrowing. But so the question is, where do you find the money? And we've seen, Phil Goff, David Cunliffe, Paul Goldsmith, Judith Collins have all been tripped up on that, in opposition. And for a very simple reason, you've got like the entirety of, the Treasury and the massive resources of government to do your bean counting for you in government. In opposition, you've got a few people huddled over a spreadsheet, right? So by bringing in this new cost saving, consultants, again, very hard to actually isolate $400 million worth of the exact consulting and contracting costs that you're going to.
Is that fair? I mean, it's kind of a very handy whipping boy, and very unlikely to see people marching on the streets in defence of the consultant class. But is it fair? I mean, there are a lot of people doing a lot of work, on COVID response, different areas, on introducing new IT schemes. These things don't happen without people to do them.
No, for sure. And look, that real ballooning in consulting costs, consulting costs were going up, and they've consistently gone up under every government, I think. But they really ballooned out under COVID. And that makes sense. Ministry of Health was not an operational agency at all, and it was brought in to do all these operational things. So what you had was sort of legions of kind of consultants. It wasn't particularly effective, right? Because what you had was bureaucrats in meetings deferring to these sort of expert consultants who don't know anything about running a pandemic response or the health system. They're just sort of suits and ties in a meeting, right? So, and look, there are horror stories, from my time working in government, from my time contracting in government, there are enough horror stories out there that I don't think it will be hard, if this is challenged in any meaningful way, it won't be hard for National to bring out examples, because there really is this I think the big area of concern is actually the growth of those big four consultancies, and even basic policy functions being delegated out to people on massive hourly fees.
I mean, the RNZ stuff was a good example of that, I think, in terms of understanding, people being paid $900 a day or whatever it was. $9,000 a week? I can't remember.
Yeah, $900 a day was just the establishment board, which I think is fair.
And it didn't hurt, did it, that Christopher Luxon and Nicola were able to point to the former minister responsible for public services, Chris Hipkins, and his determination to cut this stuff. I think maybe what they'll do is Simeon Brown will call every single public service contractor to his office and grill them individually and then make a call. What do you make of it all, Annabelle?
Well, I think the first two groups that usually get shot in an election year are Māori and bureaucrats. So I think, in that regard, there wasn't anything that surprising in Luxon's speech. Obviously, the ECE stuff is a play for the middle ground, and not a bad one. I think that the article that Shane Te Pou wrote the other week for the Herald on this is really interesting and well worth a read, which is about, if we really care about ECE, and we should, because everything shows that, kids who are involved in early childcare, fare much better in the education and all of that sort of stuff. But it's been sort of taken over by some big corporates that are making a lot of money and not necessarily, very wholesome in their business practices. Their staff are low paid. They, tend to understaff their services. They tend to take people who are less qualified so that they can keep pay rates down. So if we're just going to move a whole lot of public money into that space, wouldn't we better off? If we really care about early childcare, wouldn't we make it a part of our public education system? And I think there's a really strong argument. So it would have been great to see a policy that addresses those sorts of issues. My other concern is when we start talking about tax rebates, that requires some interaction with IRD. And, in my experience, when people have to get online or get on phones or apply for stuff and fiddle around with paperwork and applications, they tend not to go through with it if you're a family that doesn't have a lot of resource. So quite often they end up missing out on those types of schemes. And it's people, the middle class who have the accountants, who have the ability to jump online and fill out complex forms and upload PDFs, and that tend to be the ones who benefit most from it. So some concerns around that. Just coming back to the consultants and stuff, it's really become the tikanga in Wellington that everything, almost like the decision-making is now outsourced to these consultants, and people like to have something to, I guess, point at when they're getting asked hard questions about policies or whatever. They like to be able to say, look, this is what KPMG says, or this is what, Deloitte say, or whatever. So I think there probably has been an overuse of consultants in Wellington. If you were to make gliding on today, it would probably look a lot sexier. You'd have way better sets and stuff. So there, there's probably definitely some savings to be made here, but we've had a lot of policies and issues in the country that have required some expertise, and that we simply don't have in the bureaucracy. And so, while it's easy to take a shot at them, bureaucrats are part of the machinery of government, and if you want to get stuff done, you've got to have them. And they're freaked out by media and opposition politicians, and they want to cover their asses and be able to point to a very expensive piece of paper and say, look, we've crunched all the numbers and here it is. So
if Christopher Luxon had a pretty good week last week, he's had a less good week this week. He first caught a bad poll. Not bad poll, a baddish poll, and then he caught COVID, which meant he's not been able to appear in Parliament or do his interviews. The poll, should we talk about that a little? This was the Kantar poll for One News, which had Labour down 2 on 36, National down 3 on 34, ACT on 11 up 1, Greens on 11 up 4, Te Pāti Māori on 3 up just over 1, New Zealand First on 3 up nearly 1%. And in the preferred Prime Minister category, Chris Hipkins was up 4 to 27%, although I noticed looking into it that Jacinda Ardern has gone down 2 as well, so I'm assuming that most of them accepted that she wasn't returning and have now moved to Chris Hipkins. Christopher Luxon, though, down 5 to 17, which is not going to make very happy viewing for him. We know, Ben, that it's been deprivation of oxygen in the first part of the year for various reasons, including the change in leadership, including the cyclone. But nevertheless, while it might be premature to say there's going to be talk of coups and all that again, he's not going to be happy.
Yeah, all the indicators across the polls are going the wrong way for Luxon, which is a challenge for him, right? His PPM score seems to be going down. His favourability is sort of staying low. This is a problem for him and for National. He's sort of busted out, one of about sort of 3 lines that you can use in this situation, saying the people of New Zealand have got to get to know me. I mean, it's been about 15 months or so, 14 months. At this stage, what did Shane Retty say? The public of New Zealand don't know him like I do. I mean, I'm not sure what the hidden depths are because, in his State of the Nation, he said, I want to tell you a bit more about myself. And then he just did 3 paragraphs about I'm ambitious for New Zealand. Actually, I want rising standards.
Nicola Willis was very good in sort of talking about him. I mean, the difficulty is that, of course, that's not the bit that gets onto the news. But I don't know, how do you do that? Is there actually talking about? You remember when Simon Bridges produced a video of him playing the drums, and you do all these sorts of things, and people like you, Ben, are contracted in, the good consultants, that is, the golden ones, and say produce a video playing the drum. I mean, the only time Simon Bridges really managed to radiate likability was with the Yaks after he'd finished, basically, after he was done. How do you do it? Like, it's all very well to say it. It's all very well to say we need to introduce the real leader to the people. How?
Well, I think that's the thing. Imagine being at a party and thinking to yourself, okay, that person over there just needs to get to know me. How do you go about that? You sort of
without absolutely creeping them out.
Yeah, and it honestly is the same for politicians. You have some characters who are just sort of larger than life. People like Jacinda Ardern who sort of just kind of radiate their personality, and you just know as soon as you see them what kind of person they are, right? Luxon, he is a bit more sort of from the he's either from central casting or he's from the factory, of national leaders, and so it is harder for him to differentiate himself. On the other hand, that's not necessarily crucial to winning the election. People don't have to love him. Hipkins is on a high right now. Absolutely, he's had, he's new, he's fresh, he's adopted the popular position of abandoning all of Jacinda Ardern's policies. He has had, perversely the tailwind of some natural disasters where you do get to show your leadership qualities. He's dealt with that well. He's had a really good first 7 weeks in the job. On the other hand, food price inflation came out on Monday. It's 12% for the year. Fresh fruit and vegetables are up 23%. Rich PR consultants like me are struggling to buy a second-hand car. The cost of living issue hasn't gone away. People believe Hipkins when he said, you can tell from those ratings in the polls and Labour going up, people believe Hipkins that he's going to try and help them out on cost of living. There's still 7 months till the election to see whether he does that. So, you can't forget the environmental factors. But the electorate didn't turn on Jacinda Ardern because they suddenly thought she was a flake or a fraud, or they found something sort of intensely dislikable about her. The electorate, a third of Labour voters deserted Labour because their cost of living was going up, because things were materially harder for them and they didn't see any assistance from the government. And so that's Hipkins's challenge, in order to maintain all of these positive ratings, in the next 7 months.
After the State of the Nation speech that Luxon gave, he was pretty good on the detail, talking about the policy, and maybe the priority should be less soft serves at McDonald's drive-throughs and more releasing policy and speaking about it. Like it doesn't feel like something that is to do with sharing your personality, but maybe it is. Maybe that's in that particular environment that you were talking about, what people want to see. What do you think, Annabelle? There is that poll, paradoxically, Nicola Willis's performance strength is the risk that Luxon might face. Remember when Andrew Little was struggling, albeit the Labour Party at the time, sitting substantially lower in the polls, but everyone started talking about the Ardern deputy moving up through the preferred prime ministers, and it was getting closer and closer, and then eventually overtook. Now, Nicola Willis is currently on 1%. Yeah, let's not get carried away here.
I think 8 and 4 is a bit different from 17 and 1.
For sure, for sure. But I mean, is there any sense in which Luxon's leadership is? Thomas Coughlan had a piece on the day of that State of the Nation reporting kind of murmurings of murmurings. It's completely that nobody is suggesting that there is any plot whatsoever, but these things can take hold.
I think the challenge for Luxon is that because he is so new to politics, because he has never been a minister, let alone a prime minister before, that, we probably shouldn't underestimate probably some of the personal resentments and stuff that are already in that caucus, seeing this guy who's just been helicoptered in by John Key, been given this prime job. And so, I imagine that while there's, National feel relieved that the revolving door of leadership has slowed, that, and that, they had the lift and they started going up. I do feel that if this pattern were to continue, he probably would be potentially in danger because people have been there a long time, some in that caucus, and they're sick of being on the opposition benches. And
they've also been in there a long time and witnessed some pretty horrendous leadership, so they might be feeling, with all that PTSD in the system, they might be feeling quite assured that at least he's not going to.
Well, the Ardern experiment sort of opened the door for this, right? The idea that you just sort of drop in a super sub, and the combination of the honeymoon, fresh leader, and their inherent qualities propels you to an unlikely victory.
Someone holding the slipstream, and then what do you call it in running? And
look, the Hipkins transition, that sort of bolsters the case for that in close to an election year.
In Australia, Scott Morrison.
Oh yeah.
I do think that what's been different this time, as opposed to in the past, is that Nicola Willis is shaping up to be a real formidable deputy leader. And I mean, who knows, but potentially there might be some backroom conversations that are had where he might be encouraged to allow her to come forward and make it look, classy and without all the bloodletting and stuff. I don't know, but if I was him, I would be worried.
You can't write off election year insanity just because of what we've seen over the past few elections. But there's certainly nothing happening right now. There's no plotting. There's no This is, if you look at where National was before Luxon took over, this is just a different league in terms of closeness.
Yeah.
They would be absolutely crazy to do anything right now.
So what I do think is the difficulty, though, is that, they're going to need the Māori Party, and everything that he's doing just further alienates National and the Māori Party from each other. And it's interesting because Key was so different in that approach. He was way more kind of pragmatic and
Well, I don't know if he was during the election. I mean, during the election, Key sort of said, yeah, we'll biff the Māori seats. That's still our policy. He obviously was more sort of conciliatory about things like Waitangi, but yeah, I just think the bigger barrier there is ACT. Now, that is an interesting point, though, which is that right now there hasn't been a poll which shows Labour can govern without the Māori Party for about 6 months, I don't think.
Yeah.
And we still don't really know what the Māori Party think about anything except, some very niche kind of policies, funding Te Matatini at a level comparable to, performing arts organisations, dropping any kind of regulation of rongoa, but, very specific, particular niche kind of things that they prosecute on social media and
which is perfect for
they have some good stuff on their website.
Governing negotiations.
Look, absolutely. Gives them some quick wins, etc. But it is fascinating to see how little we know actually about their position on most things, really.
Yeah, I had a look on their website the other day, and they had some interesting stuff on there, like any debts incurred with wins are forgiven. Any grants that you need to get, you won't be indebted to wins, universal student allowance, all of those sorts. So they've got, it's not super broad, but they've got some kind of key ones that they're focusing on that are quite good. Probably some of them need to be updated a bit, but there are some interesting points there.
We've got to go. Quickly, a word on Georgina Beyer, who died last week, the giant of Carterton, MP, Mayor. Annabelle, you had Georgina on an episode of Mātangareia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was wonderful. She was a lovely wahine. One of the things that surprised me when we made Mātangareia was how mamai she was still with Helen Clark over foreshore and seabed, and she talked about how for her personally she was in such a tough position because unlike the rest of the Māori caucus who had a Māori mandate to be there via the Māori electorates, she was in a general seat and her electorate wanted her to vote for the legislation, but, as a wahine Māori, she was totally against it. So she asked Clark if she could abstain from the vote, and she wasn't allowed to. And she said that was the point where she knew her parliamentary career was over, and she just completely fell out of favour with Clark. Not that she had been particularly close to her, but she said that she vowed to herself at that point that she would never ever allow herself to be put in that position again. And yeah, she was a woman of principle and a trailblazer and a groundbreaker and all of those things. But I had the pleasure of holding her handbag while we shot sequences outside Parliament, and that's one of my badges of honour.
And the woman who kept Paul Henry out of the New Zealand Parliament as well. Georgina Beyer was, when we talk about a House of Representatives and, one of the things that often gets talked about is bringing in people from a wide range of experiences and backgrounds. And, if you think about civil unions back in 2004, prostitution law reform in 2005, those were both bills where Georgina Beyer's presence, were sort of, really striking, managed to change minds in the House. And, it was a real testament, sort of things that you can bring to a democracy. So RIP.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, Sam. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Gone by Lunchtime. This podcast was brought to you by the URL thespinoff.co.nz/members.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Pōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama, the Kōpapa Korangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spinoff Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.